Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on February the 14th, 2008. Newcomers look into my website, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and you'll find lots and lots and lots of talks concerning all the different elements that go into creating and controlling and planning this great new world order that we're all being ushered through at the moment, not towards, but through. And once you come through the sheep pen into the new sheep pen, you'll find it's vastly different from the one you had before, much smaller, more controlled. And you won't be playing around there if you have no function for you. It will be a function-only new, brave new world. And I was thinking about that today. Before I go on to this, I should really talk about the other website. Go into alanwattssentinel.eu for the transcripts in the various languages of Europe. Download them, print them up, and pass them around. But yeah, I was thinking about that today, the different sciences that have gone on for such a long, long, long time to do with mind control. Mind control works pretty well on everyone, especially the scientific types, the electronic types, and how it's been used on the public for probably 100 years that we know of, beginning with the World War I, starting with propaganda, basic propaganda, and then the experiments that were carried on at Tavistock Institute to find ways to motivate vast amounts of men in the public to join up in the military and go abroad and serve. And that brought me to the whole idea. I used to wonder, why would so many people just rush off and fight? And sure enough, part of it can be explained by the tribal system. And you're reared in a tribal system with national anthems and colors and flags, emblems and figures of authority. That's very, very tribal. But unfortunately, it's outlasted or outlived its usefulness, really, or its initial purpose, because we have psychopaths at the top of the tribes. And they're interbred. They have been for a long, long time, many centuries. And they employ some of the brighter people amongst us, you might say, to work for them and study us like you study any other animal, and find your Achilles heel and then exploit you quite simply by using scientific techniques, especially that of the media. But they also use electronic devices as well. And that's where it's all going, is electronic techniques of controlling the mind, even remotely, in fact, and eventually down to precise control, which will be done through microchipping. That's definitely on the cards for the elite before they can feel perfectly safe for the brave new world. But going back to the little Tavistock idea from World War I and the BBC and the propaganda techniques that it already understood, it simply was using it on a mass scale with radio when radio first came out. And it worked very, very, very well. They came up with novels that they used to do on stage, and they acted out these novels on stage in plays about the great hero going off to war and goodbye, darling, and all that kind of stuff, and then returning afterwards as more of a man than he'd been before, and how everybody respected him, this great server of his country. But when they went onto the radio waves, they upgraded it all and adapted it for mass audiences who had to visualize, because they couldn't see a stage play, so to visualize the thing. So they got expert writers and early psychologists and that type of thing, so that you could picture the hero and the heroine and all those people in your mind, and it works very well. However, TV took over, and it's not good enough yet. Even though we emulate everything on TV, it's not good enough. They're going towards the total control of individuals, right down to the individual. You must be predictable. At the moment, yes, the mass psychology, mass indoctrination works on most people, but not everyone. And that's their problem. It's the few in the group who can still retain their thinking powers that they want to target. And that's why they've been picking young children at school, especially males who have leadership qualities. And ask questions. Once who ask questions, they're very inquiring. Teachers now call them nuisances. But now, of course, if you ask too many questions, you're hyper, or you've got problems of some kind or another. They never stop and think maybe the stuff, the social indoctrination they're being taught at school might just be boring to that particular child. Maybe you can see through the indoctrination process. A lot of them do. So there's always another reason for what's being done, especially scientifically. And it's amazing, within a generation we've allowed the children to be drugged by the pharmaceutical industries. Not just that, the parents have been indoctrinated mainly through the daytime media and their heroes that they watched during the daytime media on talk shows, that this is good for their children. It's utterly amazing that this has happened so quickly through simple indoctrination. Plus you find lots of parents today have no time for their children. They want to be left in peace to play their own particular games, and the children are supposed to go off and play their own games. And the parents don't have much time for them, so a child that's always asking questions is now a nuisance. The old thing about being bonded to your children, I think, has been broken for many people for a long, long time. And going back to this war thing, why do so many people just go off and fight wars? And yes, going off to fight a war to save your tribe was a natural survival instinct at one time. But today, it's so easy to get them to go off. They don't even need much persuasion, really, in propaganda. Not much at all. Because they've been trained, the winners in this new brave new world for the last 15, 16, 20 years even, with video games, are the guys with the big guns, the Rambos, and the camo or the black suits, and they want to be like them. In those video games, there's no such thing as an emotional winner. Emotion is out the window. It's just brute force that wins the day. And children intuitively go towards the powerful. That which is powerful is what they gravitate to. So they grow up recognizing subconsciously who the winners are in this system. It's like Mao Zedong said, power comes from the barrel of a gun, and the bigger the gun, the better. And they can grow up to be the real G.I. Joes, and they're given a free rein pretty well to go off and kick butt, as they say, which means slaughter people with impunity. That's the sad state of affairs we live in today. Very few question anything. And as I say, the propaganda today is almost minimalistic as compared to what it used to be in wars gone by. Heavy propaganda was laid on in previous times. Daily barrages of utter tripe and nonsense was churned out all day long, every day, by major media. Today you don't need very much at all. They don't really inquire as to why they're over fighting. They just want to go and fight. And then they come home and they bitch and complain as to why their countries are fallen apart. And then they pick a group that's dominating them, or they perceive as dominating them, and they blame them for the domination. The thing is, they never ask themselves if they're so easy to control themselves en masse, perhaps a small minority is a natural order, if they're so willing to go off and get slaughtered or fight other people and never benefit from it themselves. But they can't think that far. They've got to blame someone else for their own misfortunes. And that's the world we live in. And behind it all is this great science and the myriad of agencies of MI6, CIA, Mossad, and all the rest of them worldwide that have all merged forces, the KGB. We even have KGB leaders now running Homeland Security in the U.S. And the generation, like Plato says, that lives through the massive changes where right is wrong and wrong is right and everything's turned upside down are the last ones to even notice. Most people don't even remember what the Cold War was or how evil the supposed KGB was as compared to your own good guys. And here you have KGB agents running their Homeland Security and ex-Nazis and all the rest of it. But people don't mind as long as they can still continue in a certain amount of freedom and play themselves, go and play and enjoy themselves. commentary. However, but it's scientifically run. Everyone's heard of the experiments on shocks that were given in a big experiment in not just one but different universities, where they'd bring in supposed people who would administer the shocks to others they'd see through a glass, other students that were strapped in a chair, and they would have a dial with different levels of shock to administer, and they administered on command of a supervisor. Those experiments were funded by your tax money to try and find out why people obey authority. As long as someone else is telling the one who administers the shocks to increase it and keep doing it, they generally will do as they're told. You displace the blame onto someone else. However, even during these experiments, they find the few who seem to enjoy administering the shocks. Now, the whole point with this was the one who was administering the shocks were told that it was all fake. No real shocks were administered. The person in the chair and the different people that would rotate in and out of those chairs were volunteers who knew they were not going to be shocked. It was all bogus, but they would scream and howl and make it very realistic. The whole point, as I say, is to find out why people obeyed authority, even when it became sadistic and cruel. A book was put out called Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. That's Milgram. And that was Harper Torch Books. It goes through the whole experiment from every possible angle in an existential type of viewpoint. Remember, existentialists really have no real cry to emotions to deal with. They simply look at the observations, look at the data, look at the types of experiments, tear it apart to find out why it works the way it does. It's like taking a firearm apart to find out why it works, how it works. Nothing else really matters to them, because what they're after are the tools of authority and how to use that authority in obedience and get the obedience from your victims. And this stuff is passed up the ladder to all the big intelligence agencies, who really are behind it all too. Mind control did not begin with MK Ultra. That's a great misperception, that somehow it wasn't in vogue. Such a lie there. From the days of the first mental hospital in England, they were already studying human nature, and even before that. So this kind of information is vital to intelligence agencies who want to control vast amounts, maybe whole countries, nations of people, on behalf of the masters, the dominant minority, as it's called at the top. So people should go and read that book, Obedience to Authority, by Stanley Milgram, because it does give you an insight into what you think are the average person, people you'd even know, but we go into categories within this particular book. Male and female were sorted out, different age groups too, to find out if there's any differences, and they didn't find any difference even as to the ones who would apply the shocks on command. They just had a different way of dealing with it, or even displacing the blame. Quite fascinating, really, a study in itself, and I'm sure this, amongst many, many other experiments, this book has been widely read by those in authority at the top. What this kind of book portrays, as I say, is a society that can be manipulated to do anything whatsoever, believe anything whatsoever, by training just like an animal, because that's really how they view the public. And unfortunately, regardless of what we think of ourselves, is either a spiritual being or whatever you want to, however you want to look at it, is irrelevant to those at the top. They only look at what works for them. And they do see us as animals, and unfortunately, regardless of what we think of ourselves or how we think of ourselves, the techniques they use on us are very effective. Very, very effective. And that goes for people who belong to religions and those who don't. It doesn't matter. People of all categories come under the effects of these very precise sciences. I'll be back with more after the following messages. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. Going through some of the thoughts that go through my head on a daily basis, and just before this program started, I went through and grabbed a book that came to mind called Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. That's a Harper Torch Books publication. And in the preface, I'll read a little bit of the preface here because it's interesting how scientists look at us. They cut out all really emotion, all the little things that make you human, that tie you to those around you, that dispel with the whole idea of love or acceptance and genuineness within a person, or even giving. They have to always boil it down to something in return because they can't understand being human. Scientists are very cold in this respect. They're psychopathic too, the ones who study us. And the preface says here, obedience, because of its very ubiquitousness, is easily overlooked as a subject of inquiry in social psychology. But without an appreciation of its role in shaping human action, a wide range of significant behavior cannot be understood. For an act carried out under command is, psychologically, of a profoundly different character than action that is spontaneous. The person who, with inner conviction, loathes stealing, killing, and assault may find himself performing these acts with relative ease when commanded by authority. Behavior that is unthinkable in an individual who is acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. The dilemma inherent in obedience to authority is ancient, as old as the story of Abraham. What the present study does is to give the dilemma contemporary form by treating it as subject matter for experimental inquiry, and with the aim of understanding rather than judging it from a moral standpoint. See, there's no moral standpoint in observation here. There's no right and wrong in the existentialist type of point of view. It's just what are the effects. The important task from the standpoint of a psychological study of obedience is to be able to take conceptions of authority and translate them into personal experience. It's one thing to talk in abstract terms about the respective rights of the individual and of authority. It's quite another to examine a moral choice in a real situation. We all know about the philosophic problems of freedom and authority, but in every case where the problem is not merely academic, there is a real person who must obey or disobey authority, a concrete instance where the act of defiance occurs. All musing prior to this moment is merely speculation, and all acts of disobedience are characterized by such a moment of decisive action. The experiments are built around this notion. When we move to the laboratory, the problem narrows. If an experimenter tells a subject to act with increasing severity against another person, under what conditions will the subject comply, and under what conditions will he disobey? The laboratory problem is vivid, intense, and real. It is not something apart from life, but carries to an extreme and very logical conclusion certain trends inherent in the ordinary functioning of the social world. The question arises as to whether there is any connection between what we have studied in the laboratory and the forms of obedience we so deplored in the Nazi epoch. The differences in the two situations are, of course, enormous, yet the difference in scale, numbers, and political context may turn out to be relatively unimportant, as long as certain essential features are retained. The essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, and he therefore no longer regards himself as responsible for his actions. Once this critical shift of viewpoint has occurred in the person, all of the essential features of obedience follow. The adjustment of thought, the freedom to engage in cruel behavior, and the types of justification experienced by the person are essentially similar, whether they occur in a psychological laboratory or the control room of an ICBM site. The question of generality, therefore, is not resolved by enumerating all the manifest differences between the psychological laboratory and other situations, but by carefully constructing a situation that captures the essence of obedience. That is, a situation in which a person gives himself over to authority and no longer views himself as the efficient cause of his own actions. And that's also true. You'd be surprised how many people listening now would go along with pretty well any order if someone with all the apparel of authority, especially the military type with all the spaghetti on their caps that they wear and their epaulets and all the rest of it, the regalia that you're taught to look up to, commanded you to do something that was really obscene. You'd be surprised how many people you know would instantly follow orders too. Maybe even shoot you if they were told to. This understanding, although they were doing this in a laboratory, was not new. It was not new. This is a low-level experiment, a re-experiment, obviously, because they were doing this type of thing much, much longer ago. In fact, many of the secret societies, just before the French Revolution, and some of the people admitted to this and wrote about it, they were bringing in members who were blindfolded, and they were told, after they promised that they'd do anything they were told by their superior for freedom, that the person in front of them, who they could reach out and feel, was to be killed, and that they would swear that they would do it. And they were told that it was their brother. And if they were given a knife and were told to stab, and if they did it, they were accepted, only to find out, of course, it was an animal they'd used. Instead, they substitute an animal at the last minute. But that's the sort of techniques that were used in the 1700s for some of the assassination squads for various revolutions. And they do have them, they still have them today, only they don't need all these silly rituals to go through them. You find a lot of psychopaths will join them, and there are psychopaths within society. The problem is most of the ones doing the experimentation on the public, unfortunately, are psychopaths themselves. You can see that even with Skinner and the behaviorists. These guys used to take babies and drop them 6 inches to a foot onto hard tables to watch the reactions quite calmly and scribble down notes with their observations, which really fascinated them. These characters are real strange, almost inhumane. Well, they are inhumane, but almost not human as far as their psychological makeup goes. And Skinner himself invented the Skinner cage, where he brought his own daughter up in it for a while, where she was put into a confined environment, because the whole theory rested on the fact that if you alter a person's environment, you alter their behavior. And unfortunately, once again, they get a lot of power out of a person like Skinner's observations, which they can then use on the public. An example of that is quite simple. The radio and then the television altered the behavior of people. So something in your environment that wasn't there before altered completely your behavior. People used to talk before radio came along, or TV. They used to talk to each other. Strange concept. And they talked about everything that happened in their lives and their speculations or their wishes or fantasies and all that kind of stuff, or their own history and their family history. Things that were rather fascinating. But once radio came in and then television, suddenly everyone's sitting there all quiet listening to this little speaker blabbing away and the fun little man on the screen, and all conversation between people pretty well stopped. When the TV goes off, the conversation is like Brzezinski said, it all comprises of all the info that's just been downloaded with by the television set. That's an example of behavior modification through alteration of your immediate environment, something in your environment. Quite simple, really. Now, I'll be back with more of this after the following messages. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. Trying to point out some of the techniques that are used on the general public. And it's not only the general public at large that are used all the time. Experiments are done on individuals throughout the general population without their knowledge. And that's why I always tell people, no matter what your experience, and I've told myself the same thing, you've got to question all the possibilities that could have contributed to it. And always ask yourself, too, if you have a way out type experience, is it possible that you're part of an experiment? Because these things do happen. They do happen on quite a large scale. We find that even within the New Age movements, the CIA was heavily involved at the very beginning. People should read the histories on places like Jonestown. They should see who promoted Jones at the beginning. And you find Ronald Reagan gave him permission with some of his followers to go into mental hospitals and work with the patients. We'll see what happened to the followers eventually. And you'll find, too, the CIA's fingerprints were all over the massacre at the end. So much goes on that's so gruesome that it's hard for us to even not just comprehend, but accept the proof when we find it. It's abhorrent to real people to know and accept that your own government has agencies specializing in, and brutality isn't a bad enough word for it. Again, in the vocabulary, there's no good or bad. It's only results that matter. But we don't have the vocabulary in this day and age to describe the kind of acts that go on people across the planet, put out by agencies and assassins working for the biggest governments, supposedly the most advanced governments on Earth. It's horrific. It's horrifying to see what's done. And right down, as I say, to even the personal level, when the CIA were involved with the New Age movement. And we've all seen, at least the ones who looked into the Canada, the CBC archives, to find the Wendy Mesler shows, where Nick Begich demonstrated some of the equipment the CIA had and were using back in the 1950s that could put sounds and thoughts right into your head. And if they could put sounds and thoughts right into your head, who's to say they couldn't affect the visual cortex as well? And I'm sure that went on a big scale, especially within some of the big centers that were promoted for the whole New Age movement. Some of them even guaranteed the customers, those who joined some of these classes, they would hear God talking to them. Guaranteed it. And they did. Because they had the same equipment that Begich had embedded in the walls. That's why it works, you see. But that's what we know about. And that equipment was so small, an operative could put it in his pocket with the size of a TV remote controller. 1950s technology, only used by the CIA and upper groups in MI6. It had to be solid-state circuitry, microcircuitry, and that was in the days before people even heard of the transistor radio. We're living, as I say, in different levels of reality. Those with the higher sciences are so far ahead of anything we have knowledge of, and that's why they get away with it, because when we see the effects of something that cannot possibly happen, it only cannot possibly happen because we think we're not that advanced. Your friends, your relatives, and everyone you know would laugh at you, especially the ones who keep up with the scientific magazines. They think that's the latest technology they're being told about. Therefore, they'll ridicule you if you suspect or mention that you suspect there's much, much higher sciences. It was the same with Bill Cooper. And Bill Cooper, when he first came out, went around New Age circuits expounding on the fact that the UFOs were not only here, the aliens were here too, and that they had been for a long time. And I have the old videos of him talking about this. He was a complete believer. And the data that he got came from when he worked in the Navy, in intelligence, until he went to Area 51 and realized that they were making those things here. It was advanced science. And that he was a dupe. The best dupe or willing fool is someone who truly believes in the cause of what they're doing. And he realized he'd been fed the information deliberately. And so that he would go around a person who had authority, at one time respect for his position as an officer in the Navy, in intelligence, and the people would believe him. And when he came to that conclusion that he had been used and duped, he turned 180 degrees and spoke out against it told the public he was completely wrong. He told them that he'd been fed this information to dupe himself first. He must be believable, therefore you dupe the person first to become a true believer, and then your senses don't detect any lies coming from that person. You will believe them. It's much easier to believe them when they themselves believe it. Old technique again. And when he started doing that, that's when he was driven off the road on his motorcycle by a car. That's how he lost his leg. Then he got a visit in the hospital by two men who told him to shut up and not continue on this path of exposing the fact that we're made here. It was very important to convince the public that they came from out there somewhere. So anybody can be made to be a real dupe, and that's why I say always question your own experiences. What scientific means could be used to put them there? And I mean that for myself as well. I always question everything. I'll tell people about experiences, but I won't tell them what I thought the cause was, because you put it in a question mark box until you have more data. Without the data, you're simply being a dupe. The fact is we live in a horrific system cannot be denied, though. The more you go into the studies that have been done on society in times of peace and war, it would make you shiver. You wonder if you want to belong to the human race at all. And when you realize where they're going with all of this, which is total control, the future truly does look bleak indeed. I get young people writing to me who are in despair when they've woken up to look at a future. People at 19 and 20 look at a future that seems pretty bleak to them. They can't even communicate with their friends or parents anymore. And these young people have woken up. They know what's coming down. They know what will come down. And they can't communicate to others. And they ask you what to do. And it's a hard call to make, because the future certainly does look bleak. And I try to remind them that this agenda has taken centuries to build up to this present point. And therefore any counter force to it has to also snowball slowly. And so the effects of what we're doing even here tonight might not take shape till 50 or 100 years in the future. That's how you come at this kind of thing. It's an ancient war. It's a war for everything. It's a war that every tyrant in history has dreamed of winning, and that's total control over the minds of people. The closest it has ever come to before in times gone by was when the big religions had an ignorant population indoctrinated into the reality contained within just their holy books. They knew nothing else outside those books. They didn't read those books, by the way. It wasn't, remember, until really the early 1900s, late 1800s, that the general population could even get a chance to be taught to read and write. For thousands of years, scribes were the guys in charge of reading and writing. There were many, many kings and queens who hired them to do the reading and writing for them. Kings and queens looked upon that as being a menial task. But the general population were always kept in ignorance through various dark ages in all countries across the planet. And all they knew was their own little Plato's cave, and that contained all the writings or the sayings from their priesthoods. And therefore, they were under a great mind control. And science, being as it is a double-edged sword, comes along with technology, and they had to give basic writing and reading to the public, which opened Pandora's box. That's where science took over to control us from the priesthoods. Back with more after the following messages. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix. And like most things, it certainly is an inside job. And the greatest tricks are played upon nations come from the top of the same nations. And no one can write about a brave new world and even give an idea of when it's supposed to start breaking out before the event, and then, like winning the lotto, they just happen to be so lucky and get their wish. It's rather a simple thinking indeed to believe that such machinery for internal policing and IDing and all the rest of it is just spontaneously being carried out because of 9/11. It took years in the planning, and you can go far back as the beginning of FEMA, where I think even Nixon signed the first bill into law to set up that organization. And you'll find that the Homeland Security in its initial write-ups was to follow the FEMA-type structure on a much, much larger scale. It's simply escalating from one to the other to the other. Long-term planning. Because back even in the days of Nixon, they talked about the possibility of the masses losing the minds of the masses to the supposed communists. And there was a propaganda war for the minds of the public, because the psychopathic elite of any country look upon everyone else as part of the masses. You're not an individual, you're part of the masses. So the propaganda is aimed at the masses, the simplicity of the masses. And the elite of the West were terrified at one point, not so much of controlled opposition within Russia, which they did control, but because there were many copycat groups that sprung up thinking it was all real and demanding justice and freedom and all the rest of it. So they had to start organizations which were bigger than the CIA, that was supposedly only meant to scrutinize people outside of the country. They needed an internal organization to start really, even above the FBI. They could take track of millions of citizens if need be, and they set up the machinery for complete martial law, which they foresaw using one day. They don't set these things up without the intent to use them. And when the New American Century Agenda was drafted up in the 90s, published in 92, I think the first time, and then redrafted and rewritten, and put out again in 98, with its wish list of countries to conquer and the things that must be done, and they get their very wish at the beginning, 2001. Then it all fell into place, and it also showed that every country in the Western world had signed on to the same agenda. That took years of negotiations and planning with high bureaucracies in all those countries, years in advance before 9/11 happened, to make it all happen so well. And before I go on to any callers, I would like to just jump from that last book I was reading, Obedience to Authority, to a book by Carl Jung, who, regardless of whatever people think of them, and he certainly had his own faults too, and his own particular unshakable beliefs. But in the Undercovered Self, he talks about the character of humanity within the society as he saw it, and how they could also be manipulated and used. He talked about the possibility of psychopathic-type individuals taking over countries, and of what stood in their way, what would aid that psychopath, what would also stand in their way. And he's talking on page 55 of the Undiscovered Self about this. He says, unless he stands firmly on his own feet, the so-called objective values profit him nothing. Individual, that is, who's recovering, you might say, from their fake indoctrination, called mental illness, and coming out of it, since they then only serve as a substitute for character and so help suppress his individuality. Naturally, society has an indisputable right to protect itself against arrant subjectivisms, but insofar as society itself is composed of de-individualized persons, very important, society itself is composed of de-individualized persons. The mass is the mass. It is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists, but it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes. It is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately, everything depends on the quality of the individual, but the fatally short-sighted habit of our age is to think only in terms of large numbers and mass organizations. one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman. Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness in this respect is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheapest of slogans. Very important part to remember. Curiously enough, the churches too want to avail themselves of mass action in order to cast out the devil with Beelzebub. The very churches whose care is the salvation of the individual soul. They too appear, or do not appear to have heard anything of the elementary axiom of mass psychology, that the individual becomes morally and spiritually inferior in the mass. And for this reason, they do not burden themselves overmuch with the real task of helping the individual to achieve a metanoia, or a rebirth of the spirit. Dio consentente. It is unfortunately only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either. For society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into a social organization. That's what the churches have become. And reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he is the one important factor, and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. It is true that mass meetings parade such ideas before him and seek to impress him by dint of mass suggestion, with the unedifying result that when the intoxication has worn off, the mass man promptly succumbs to another, even more obvious and still louder slogan. His individual relation to God would be an effective shield against these pernicious influences. Did Christ ever call his disciples to him at a mass meeting? Did the feeding of the 5,000 bring him any followers who did not afterwards cry, "Crucify him"? With the rest, when even the rock named Peter showed signs of wavering, are not Jesus and Paul prototypes of those who, trusting their inner experience, have gone their own individual ways, disregarding public opinion? And what he's pointing out here is the fact that we're run by mass movements that neglect the individual, and they use slogans and mass suggestion, which makes you drown individually within the mass. You lose that essence that is you, that driving force that is you. It doesn't lift you up. It submerges you into an accepted social organization, which again, as we all know, is run by powerful people for control. They work in cahoots with the dominant minority and the bankers and all the rest of them. Well, I'll go to the phones now and we'll see what callers we've got. I think we've got Rick from California on the line. Are you there, Rick?
Yes. Hi, Alan.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Not bad.
Not bad. I'm a little bit depressed. I wanted to share or compare some things that are going on right now with the predictive programming. Okay, I'll just tell you after the commercial.
Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
We're back after these messages. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix, and we have Rick on the line. Are you still there, Rick?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to summarize three little TV shows just to tell you why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. In early 2001, there was a TV show put out called The Lone Gunman, in which the government, a faction of the government, was going to take remote control of some planes and try to fly them into the World Trade Center. And just you remember that, right?
Yeah.
And just at the last moment, they yanked the thing up, and the plane they got manual override. Well, there's two TV shows, or there's a video game being put out now called Shattered Union, and there's a TV show being put out called Jericho. And it's a video game intro, which you can download, flash on the internet, in the TV program, which you can download. Then both of them, the government, a faction of the government, sets off a nuclear bomb driven in by truck while the president is giving a speech in both of them. And then after that, there's a civil war in America, in total breakdown and chaos. And, and I was in Vaughn's last night buying some soda, and I heard them saying on the, because they have this intercom where they do the advertising, they said, "Do you have your emergency supplies ready? Are you being stocked up?" Yep. I want to do things. I want to help people. I want to do my artwork, and I just feel like it's closing in. Like they're not even hiding it. The government's telling us now they're gonna nuke us.
Yeah. Well, the only thing they've got going for them is cry wolf, cry wolf, cry wolf. Mm-hmm. And everyone knows that you aren't going to get a bunch of Arabs coming over here in camels, and with snorkels on, coming under the Great Lakes, coming to do trouble. I mean, it's not going to happen. So anything that does happen has to come from the top, and they will have to bring something on. But personally, I think I think they're going to eventually create pandemics, or at least tell us that there's outbreaks. And I thought back to the first movie that Dustin Hoffman was in, called Outbreak, and why they were hyping that up so much. And it was followed by a whole slew of them. And then, of course, you had your daytime talk shows with the experts suddenly appearing on the scene, instant experts to tell you how real this could be and how it's just around the corner and we're due a plague. So plagues would be the easiest way to control people. This isn't just to control them. Remember, it's 100 years war. That was what Rumsfeld said himself. This could be 100 years war. And by that they mean it's a war to completely reshape the whole globe and all society in every country, and a completely new way of living with a scientific type oligarchy or bureaucracy running our lives for us, and even recreating humanity itself. They're calling it the post-human era.
Wow.
So this is all programming us for what's to come, so that it will seem, we'll expect it. We won't all start asking. You see, when something hits you all of a sudden, you ask too many questions. When you've been programmed in advance through fiction, etc., then you accept it without much question and you obey. It's all again to do with obedience, that book I was reading at the beginning of the show. How do mass populations obey the authorities? Yeah, in these three episodes, they're not even officially. I mean, they're saying we'll blame it on the Arabs, but they're all saying, we're going to do it. It's like they're not even hiding it anymore. We're going to. What's that? Yeah, well, they are too. And you see, if you were to nuke, and this goes back to the NATO plans that they signed back in the early 70s. They're supposed to be available to every citizen in a NATO country, and yet the Man Alive series in Britain had to send to the government for a copy because they were not available from the post office or the library. And they talked about what they're going to do in event of a plague outbreak or a nuclear contamination. And the U.S., Canada, Britain, they all signed this agreement that the cities are to be contained, villages, towns contained, and any individual trying to break free from a contaminated area is to be shot on sight. And if whole groups try to break free, they're to be bombed by CS gas from the air. That's what they have planned. But also, they'll have mass evacuations from certain areas to other. Once you get populations moving as per refugees, that's the whole point of it. They've got a complete war situation scenario on the go where they can reshape society, build the new habitat areas, or put you into existing overcrowded cities and destroy the old. This is all part of the new greening, the new world order, the new brave new world scenario. They want mass populations on the move, and we saw that being done with New Orleans when thousands of people were evacuated out of there. They claim they can't even trace where they put them all. That's what they tell us. We don't even know if they're still alive or what happened to them. Well, I have a friend who was a journalist, and he went to New Orleans and did a story about it. And he said that black water was there killing people, open season, white supremacists were given open season to shoot blacks, and there were concentration camps. They herded
people under bridges and they were dying and kept them there, detained them, and it was total. So some of the stuff has already happened with Katrina,
And I'll bet you anything, in New Orleans, there were probably hundreds of social scientists there studying the reactions of everything that was happening, so they could use that in the future. They never miss a chance for that kind of thing.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alan, for letting me talk.
Thanks for calling.
All right. You have a good night.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
And now I've got Mo again in Oregon. Are you there? Hello?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me good?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hi, Alan. I would like to have a few comments for you and one question. My comments regarding your first hour when you talked about obedience. And, many religions are trained that to be obedient, especially Baha'is, since the birth 150 years ago. If you don't follow exactly what they say, they kick you out of their religion, and they cannot talk politics. They cannot involve in say anything about government or anything like that. And also, on top of it, in Iran, many of them were killed by Muslims, and because they don't have a self-defense, because their religion controls them, and they telling them, is you give your soul for the humanity, and therefore you have no self-defense, and many of them killed, and many of them escaped from Iran, and etc. And also we go back to the, that they have a national ID card since 150 years ago. Every Baha'i has an Baha'i identification card called BIC, and it has 9-digit numbers all over the world. So if you don't carry that with you, you cannot attend to their meetings and or the spiritual meetings, etc. And then we go back to the church, and recently they have trained the clergymen that to come to people and to tell them the same thing: obedience, obedience, obedience. Government, don't question anything, etc. too. And to complement your first hour thing again, we go back to Islam, that in United Kingdom, if a Muslim person doesn't go to the mosque, they give him 3 warnings, and after that, they kill that person in United Kingdom. This is what is going on. Religion is opium of the masses. That's what I think. What do you believe? It wouldn't matter if a deity came down here and spoke to the people today. As soon as he was gone, it would be reduced, the whole message would be reduced down to its common denominator that would suit the masses. Because the masses, unfortunately, do want, I'm talking about the base people themselves want simplicity and ritual and a set of simple rules to follow, because masses means mass. It means sameness. They want sameness. They want everyone to be the same as themselves. And that's what all religions reduce the individual down to, is a sameness. And as you say, if you break free of the sameness, then you're shunned, or even worse things will happen to you. In fact, the people around you, you actually threaten their own view of life by the very fact that you can break free. That scares them, that what they're following is not so omnipotent after all. So they themselves will turn on you. You shake their paradigm of believing. It's the same with the story of Moses. The whole story that's always told over and over in all religions, and they're all the same story. In many stories, you'll find that the whole story of Moses going up a mountain was the illumined man climbing above the masses, and that the masses were told they could not follow. They were held back by lightning and all that stuff. In other words, they were still base people. Only the illumined one could go up, and he came back down with the laws to find them remaking a god out of gold, silver, and jewels, things they understood.
In other words, they were still slaves, not slaves in the sense that you think traditionally they are. What it always meant was they were slaves to the material world and to wealth and greed and baseness. That's what it stood for.
Exactly, indeed. And that our friend, the caller before me, he talked about the shattered union, etc. He needs to watch Right at Your Door. That's the movie released in United States right now. That was censored in United States. But I advise him to see that movie. He will learn a lot too. And my question is from you is this. What's the relationship between the religion, all religions, and the New World Order?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's been again written about by the big boys, and Gorbachev talked about it. He was a member, the head of the Soviet system before he became the leader of his particular movement with the Green Cross, the Night of Lazarus, at the Presidio in the U.S., and he wrote in his book Towards a New Civilization, he said, although he himself was an atheist, he claimed in the book, he said that religion has always been used for control purposes over the masses. And he said, we are creating a new world religion that will be based on a form of earth worship. What he meant was the greening, the whole idea that we are here as another animal and we couldn't put ourselves above any other animal or above any tree, etc. of the planet. But of course you'll have a new priesthood dominating the public. And as Orwell said, he said some people are more equal than others in such utopias. In other words, there's going to be a hierarchy of the same old system with a new religion, but the same old stuff where we're told what to do, what to think, and that we're here to serve the planet. Service is ultimate in this New World Order agenda. The whole idea of eventually working for your little peanut rewards will go out, and eventually you'll be born with a duty, a service to the state. And that was written about by Cecil Rhodes, and that group blossomed into the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. And all of their major publications, they talk about service to the planet. And of course that means the hierarchy involved. It's just a transformation of the old system into a new, improved version for a new era.
Exactly, indeed. And, everybody says New World Order, Baha'i New World Order, Islamic New World Order, Christian New World Order. Actually, we received a pamphlet in Oregon. They invited everybody to attend to the conference, and Alex Ansari is one of your friends too. He attended, and he had some video of it. I'm sure in his website, also alexansari.com. And it was just trying to sell stuff. He was telling, he was just talking bunch of rubbish. The priest that who invited a lot of people to come attend, he wants to make money. So all of them are here to make money. All of them are living in mansions. They are corrupt. All of them, including the Ayatollahs in Iran, and etc. And basically, they want our money. The money that you cannot even save, and you have to go there and give a donation, and they say, oh, we will do this, we will do that, but they don't.
I know.
So, thank you very much indeed
Thanks for calling.
And you have a good night, sir.
You too. I'll be back with more after the following messages. Hi, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix. And we have Stephen on the line from Germany. Are you there, Stephen?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask you something that I found in your first book I read.
Yeah.
And the topic is, you said that it should be food for thought that things from pigs, organs of pigs are used for humans.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on this? Do you know what I mean?
We talking about the pictures and symbolism?
No pictures. Pigs, the animals.
Oh, pigs.
Mm-hmm.
The animal?
No. Yeah. You wrote that I understood it the way that you suggested that humans were made of pigs.
Oh, yeah, that's the big joke at the scientists at the top. It's also a joke about some of the orders at the top when they mention what seems to be a fact as far as we know, but who knows then again. They say that the closest animal to human is not the ape at all, but the pig as far as its particular physiology goes, the workings of it, and that's why, of course, they've tried pig transplants, and that's why they've also gone ahead and combined, from the early 70s, they've combined human DNA with that of pigs. I don't know if people in the U.S. realize the Department of Agriculture and the farming, but we're doing that in the 70s, so most pigs that you eat today have human genes in them. Yeah.
So you didn't want to suggest that humans were made of pigs?
No, not at all. I mean, regardless of what they say at the top, always remember they have a hidden meaning behind it. Generally, it's a form of mocking the public themselves. The only thing, as I say, that apparently from all the knowledge that we're given, even if it's true, is that we're closer to pigs than apes. But they're always playing jokes on us, so who really knows, who really knows? And that's what some of the old ancients used to say too, that was supposedly why they didn't want to eat the pigs. That knowledge was known back then, for instance. However, if you go into the writings of the Hindu, with much older histories, and again, you've got to take everything with a pinch of salt and don't take anything at face value. There's often allegories behind them. They do talk about a time where, in the ancient past, and they go back millions of years with their histories and mythologies. Most ancient history really takes the form of mythology. And they say that the Black Sea area at one time was a valley, and that an elite were experimenting with different kinds of humans, and that the experiment went wrong when the different kinds of humans began to eat each other, and so they flooded that, which became the Black Sea. Interestingly enough, a National Geographic magazine a few years ago shows them going down in the Black Sea with a submarine, and they found layers of settlements and old ancient buildings deep below the waters there on both sides of the valley. So there was habitation there at one time, and so it seems true that it was flooded at one point. So who knows? That's all you have to really go on. The rest is speculation.
Mm-hmm. May I add another thing?
Yes.
Are you aware of that in the UK there was somebody arrested because someone else thought that his MP3 player was a gun, and he got...
I know. I know. There's a lot of things happening now with that very thing. It's mainly, and unfortunately, it's mainly female callers with cell phones who have watched too much television and all the dramas where all the cops are always pulling guns out. We've had 20 years now on every show since Starsky and Hutch of the cops drawing their guns out, standing in a combat stance, and that's that's conditioned in the brains of people now. So this poor guy got off a bus or something, pulled out his MP3, and tried to put both hands on it, and a woman thought he was taking a pistol out of his pocket, holding it in a combat position, ready to fire, and she called the police. The guy got his DNA taken, his fingerprints, iris scan, the whole lot, and even though they knew it was a mistake, he's now on that database for life as being put down for a firearms call. Yeah. But I've had a lot of another guy I know last year. He was mailing off some chocolates to his mother for Mother's Day, and a woman was passing by in a car,
phoned him in as a suspicious character because he had a couple of days' growth of beard. And when he was in the post office, in came the SWAT team, pushed him against a wall, frisked him right down, did a complete examination, and ripped his box apart from the chocolates. This is happening all over the place, lots of incidences like this.
Yeah, may I make a comment and then go?
Yes.
I just wanted to say one thing. It's not as fast, but it's the same thing in Germany.
Yes.
Because in Bavaria there was somebody who was assaulted. His flat was assaulted by a SWAT team because somebody heard him talk about the government at his medical treatment or something.
Yeah.
And the second thing I wanted to say is that I'm very fond of that much of your material is discussed in the internet.
Yes.
And I'm very thankful that you are putting that out and others catch on. Okay.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Keep on listening. Thanks for calling. Yeah, that's interesting what's happening with all the paranoia that's been generated, again, mainly through fictional movies and dramas and stuff, and the public can't tell the difference now. It's going to get a lot worse too, unfortunately. I'll be back with more after the following messages. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix. Just showing you of some of the stuff that's going on in the world. And that last incident with the guy with the MP3 player was from metro.co.uk, February the 12th. And it said arrested, caged, and DNA tested for using MP3. A commuter was arrested at gunpoint and had his DNA and fingerprints taken simply for listening to his MP3 player while waiting for a bus. Darren Nixon was surrounded by armed police after his music player was mistaken for a gun. Oh boy. When a passerby saw the 20-year-old get out his black Philips machine to change tracks, she panicked and dialed 999. They arrested her and forced her to have her eyes examined. Police tracked Mr. Nixon using CCTV. That's those cameras that are everywhere across Britain. As he got off the bus home from work, he was surrounded by a firearms unit who bundled him into a van. He was then put in a cell, and his fingerprints, DNA, and mugshot were taken before being released. Although police realized it was a false alarm, Mr. Nixon from Stoke-on-Trent now has to live with his DNA stored on a national database. The force will also keep on record that he was arrested on suspicion of a firearms offence. That's for life now, because of some silly woman who didn't know what was going on. Mr. Nixon said, "It was unreal. I had a completely clean record before this and have always been a law-abiding citizen." The mechanic said that as he got off the bus, he saw a police gesture but could not hear what he said. He said, "As I got closer, I could see that two of the cops had guns. My heart was racing a mile a minute. One of them was hiding behind a car door, looking down his sight at me, and the other was shouting orders and pointing a gun at me. I turned the music off, and they were telling me to put my hands up in the air." The DNA records are kept for life so that they can be matched to future samples. Even suspects who are wrongfully arrested normally stay on the database. Staffordshire police said a member of the public reported seeing a man pull out a gun from his pocket, grip it with both hands and aim. A spokesman added an operation was put in place and a man matching the description was detained. So that's the kind of things that happen in this day and age of hype and terror, and people watching too many movies, and especially all the cop dramas that are out there where every 5 minutes they're pointing guns at someone's head, standing in a combat stance. And you've got silly people who can't tell fact from fiction, and they're living in terror all the time, and they're suspicious of everybody around them. Terrible state to live in. And it's being fostered from the top, of course. They want the paranoid society. And unfortunately, the ones at the bottom that haven't a clue, they can't think for themselves, will see this kind of thing all around them. They'll be so paranoid. Going back to the undiscovered self, just to do a little piece on this.
that ties in with some of this, what's happening with the state being the dictator. It said, the state, like the church, demands enthusiasm, self-sacrifice and love. Demands it, you see. And if religion requires or presupposes the fear of God, then the dictator state takes good care to provide the necessary terror. When the rationalist directs the main force of his attack against the magical effect of the right, as asserted by tradition, he has in reality completely missed the mark. The central point, the psychological effect, is overlooked, although both parties make use of it for directly opposite purposes. A similar situation prevails with regard to their respective conceptions of the goal. The goals of religion, deliverance from evil, reconciliation with God, rewards in the hereafter, and so on, turn into worldly promises about freedom from care for one's daily bread, the just distribution of material goods, universal prosperity in the future, and shorter working hours. That the fulfillment of these promises is as far off as paradise only furnishes yet another analogy and underlines the fact that the masses have been converted from an extra-mundane goal to a purely worldly belief, which is extolled with exactly the same religious fervor and exclusiveness that the creeds display in the other direction. So, in other words, he's telling you that that's what religions always turn into, promises for things in the here and now, the material needs, all the things that we worry about will be supplied by some benevolent entity if we just follow these particular rules and obey the laws of the state. It's interesting to note that the Archbishop of Canterbury in England got in the soup the other day for proposing that because there are so many other religions now in Britain, that they should bring in the Sharia law for Muslims and combine it with the laws of England. And of course that would put a separate, another standard for a particular group outside the usual natives of Britain. And then the Queen piped in, apparently, because she's the head, the titular head, as being the sovereign in Britain. You see that the sovereign's the head of everything. And she's also the head, technically, of the Church of England, and the Archbishop is still responsible to her. So she was voicing her concerns of this creating a double standard where certain transgressions would be settled in a particular closed religious court as opposed to the public one. But they couldn't really go any further with that because technically you see that they already have that for specific Jewish laws in Britain and elsewhere, where there are courts that are designed for them to handle certain problems of transgression of their own religions away from public eyes. So we already have that, and now it's an open book now, or it's a fair for all if this goes ahead, because you'd have to do the same with all religions that exist on the planet, given their own special little courts to deal with their problems far from the prying eyes of the public. And that's the mayhem which they envisaged, mind you, long ago when they planned the integration of the countries of the world and the multiculturalism and all the rest of it. And people who belong to groups and creeds and all the rest of it will have their differences and their little battles, maybe even big battles, as they try to settle it. And generally between groups, just the bigger ones generally win. It doesn't benefit the individual at all, really. And it's unfortunate that some of us have to live with the masses with no option. We're supposed to be social creatures, but to be honest with you, the more you understand about this world, the harder it becomes to be able to even go into the general public, because you realize that whatever they talk about is simply their programming. They repeat or parrot their programming. Generally, most of the public today are talking about what's on television or what they've seen. They have no real thoughts of their own. They're oblivious of the spraying above their heads, which is continuing daily. They would actually first see it and talk about it if Oprah Winfrey was to make a big deal about it, or somebody who's famous until someone who's famous does make a big thing about it, they will not see it. It's as simple as that. If the sky was tangerine or marmalade, like the Beatles sung a long time ago, it wouldn't matter to them. If no one else complained about it, they wouldn't think either. They liked to think what everyone else thinks. And that's the sadness of the world we live in. The mass man has to, and I think that's part of the whole trial being on earth. I think that's the trials we go through, is breaking out of the mass and becoming an individual. And remember, the whole concept of individuality was an alien thing only a couple of 100 years ago. People came out of serfdom in Europe. The masses were serfs. They served a Norman feudal system with this rigid hierarchy, and you were born with your place in life, and that was further superimposed on by the religion that kept you in that place. You didn't question anything, and all that you knew was what happened in your daily life, in your farm, and maybe to your neighbors. And the decrees were passed down and read in the public square by the town crier, who spoke on behalf of the crown. That was your whole understanding, and what you came home with on Sunday after a sermon at the church. That was your view of life and the world. That was your Plato's cave that you were born into. Individuality did not really start until a middle class came out in existence during the industrial era and gave some time for schooling. Schooling comes from an old Latin word for leisure. You need leisure to learn. We'll be back with more after the following messages. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and we're cutting through the matrix. We've got a couple of callers on the line. We've got Al from New York City. Are you there, Al?
Yes, Alan. Good night.
How are you?
Oh, okay. Everything's okay. I just wanted you to expand on two topics. It's probably unrelated to what you've been speaking about tonight. One is the two movies of Planet of the Apes, and all the meanings behind all the symbolism, especially in the second movie, and something on the history of Ethiopia and why Ethiopia was so hard for these powers to conquer in the past, and is that where the troglodytes originate from? And did the Ethiopians have knowledge of them, why they were able to hold them off for so long?
Well, the Planet of the Apes, again, the Planet of the Apes just came really from, again, the Darwinist view that all came from Africa. It was a play on black and white. It was very evident. And then, of course, they go into the mutation ideas that it could have turned out one way or turned out the other, with one becoming dominant, the other one inferior, and then vice versa. It was like swapping roles. And of course, the whole idea of the nuclear weaponry at the very, very end, with the big god that was a nuclear weapon, that was treated like a deity, was also to terrify the general public. When that came out, remember, they were threatening to nuke us all the time because of the Cold War. So that intensified the nuking idea as well, and that differences had to be put aside for survival's sake. So there was two or three meanings all came out in the Planet of the Apes. With Ethiopia, it's got an ancient history for sure, and they had their own. Ethiopia had a big population of Ethiopian Jews for hundreds of years, and they were eventually taken. I think they called them the Falashas. And they brought them out back in the 70s, I think. Israel flew them out during the famine and brought them to Israel. But behind them, they also left two amazing structures within the mountains there, because inside the mountains there was a very, very old, I don't know how old, no one really knows, churches that were inside the mountains. They've been carved from inside the mountain with all the rooms, and even had big pillars. One of them was the Pillar of Solomon with all the writings on it. It was always kept covered with wall hangings. They had their own ceremony of the Ark being carried around, partly Egyptian, partly Judaic. It all comes from Egypt, really. And even then, some of them, even today, they still have a lot of prejudice within Israel itself as to whether they're true Jews or not. There's a lot of racial prejudice within Judaism itself, you know. In fact, I think they were also forbidden to give blood in Israel. A lot of people were complaining they didn't want the bloods from a different colored people. So, but yeah, Ethiopia certainly has had an ancient tradition that paralleled Judaism, and Judaism itself is just a hodgepodge of different religions that pre-existed their own particular religion, put into a different format. We know the flood scenario was copied, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that came from Sumer, and simply re-updated. And many of the stories in the Old Testament are actually used in Egypt much earlier, and also even from India. A lot of them came from India. They had a Noah story there as well. So these stories are very, very old, and we'll never get to the bottom of them. However, the esoteric meaning of the ark is the ark of the covenant, which as long as the sun comes up and travels an arc across the sky every day, then you'll be blessed, because the sun gives life to plants and all the rest of it, which your animals eat, and you'll have food. It's quite simple, really. It's always the sun that's behind it that gives its life for the world and dies every day for the world at sundown.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Because after I received your materials, they're really great, and I watched the movie in a different light, The Planet of the Apes, especially.
Yes.
Especially the scenes with when they're on the checkerboard. Yeah,
it was quite good, the checkerboard there, yeah.
Upside down crosses, you know. Yeah. Oh, man. All right, good night, Alan. Thanks.
Thanks for calling.
Thanks. Bye.
And then we've got, I think we've got Leo from Massachusetts. Are you there, Leo?
Yeah. Great to hear you again. I know you're also on one of those other competing networks, but anyway, my issue was that I think that this guy, Joost van Stennis, are you familiar with him?
Who?
Joost van Stennis, the autonomous thinker.
Okay,
he talks about mass world and the elite world.
Yes.
Are you familiar with him?
Yes, and other ones are similar. There's different ones along the same vein, yeah.
And he especially spoke about the death of 1,000 flea bites, and that's what we have to inflict on the system by any means necessary and by any methods we can. And I think the real problem ethically is that many of the good things are inculcated into their system to the point where sometimes to make your point, you seemingly are beyond the pale, are over the edge, over the top. And this is something that's very difficult to fight, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I know. That's the whole thing. Our reality, as you say, is literally enmeshed with our indoctrination from the ones at the top. Our whole culture was given to us. That's the problem, including the good parts that are blended with the negatives and so on. We'd have to break free, as you say, cut by cut, bite by bite, from 1,000. It's almost like having 100 anchors holding the ship down. You want to break free, you have to take one anchor up at a time, or maybe a whole bunch up at a time from different directions, in order to break free from what is a totalitarian system that's becoming worse by the day.
I think the problem is that people don't see themselves as the Lilliputians.
Yes.
And this is the problem. They don't envision themselves in that manner, and then there's the crux of it.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And Swift, again, who wrote about that, had many allegories of society. He was an elitist himself, and so he wrote it from an elitist point of view, but he also shows you how they see the world and how the little people see the world, how they view the world. And he actually gives you some ideas of how you can break free if you had the ability, even though he was an elitist himself. You know.
I think it goes back to also, I'm 62 and I'm kind of a child of the revolution of the 60s, and I experienced the whole, without most of the drugs, I didn't really get into that, but I experienced the whole revolution in Boston area at the time, and my feeling is that the 70s advanced into something that they didn't like, and so in the 80s they brought on the Bee Gees and made this. They took an idea and they twisted it into another form, and so that thinking about your fellow man became a stylistic expression of you. So that this is the critical point that people don't see.
Yeah, that's true. If you do have a movement that is going off in a different direction than the one planned, they will try and bend it into... You see, they always say that they can use everything that happens as an opportunity, including things they didn't foresee. And when something goes awry for them, they simply they put their own leaders out and twist it off in some other direction. So you're quite right. They have to stop this whole idea of not just caring about other people, but also standing up for other people's rights. They have to stop that. And you're quite correct about that. Yeah.
The thing I see mostly is that we had a culture that was leaning towards the whole dropout, which is the most scary thing the system can't deal with.
That's right.
Because once you drop out, their whole reason for being doesn't exist anymore.
That's correct.
You basically make them obsolete.
Yes, yeah, you can make them obsolete. Their big trick is to make you believe that they are essential for the smooth running of your life. You know that the government in Belgium went on strike and they moved out. They didn't have a sitting there for months and months, and the country went on as normal. In fact, they had no laws passed, the taxes didn't go up, and they weren't missed at all. Yeah. So that goes to show you, yeah.
It's just sad to see that how well we've been brainwashed, and I think it's on a daily basis. And some people do get out, and some people don't. Unfortunately, there aren't enough of us yet.
I know.
And the thing is, how do we make them? How do we bring them over?
I think the time's coming where Joe Average will be unable, even with his indoctrination, to deny what's happening, and he'll have no choice but to start waking up very quickly to preserve himself and his family and his loved ones.
Now, you're much more positive than I am.
Well, you got to have some hope. Yeah. Thanks for calling.
Okay, bye-bye.
From Hamish and myself, up in Ontario, Canada, it's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you.